Picture the red carpets, the flashbulbs, the velvet ropes, the glittering premieres where champagne flowed and studio executives smiled for the cameras, absolutely certain they held the next blockbuster in their hands. But what if I told you that 1973, the year that gave us The Sting and The Exorcist, was also the year Hollywood learned that money, stars, and ambition couldn't guarantee success? That behind every triumph lurked a dozen failures bleeding red ink across studio ledgers? This was the twilight of old Hollywood. The roadshow musical was gasping its last breath. Counterculture audiences had moved on from studio formulas. Vietnam rage still simmered, and the executives who'd ruled the industry for decades were desperately throwing millions at projects that audiences simply didn't want. The industry was in freefall. As caught between the dying dreams of Golden Age spectacle and the gritty realism of new Hollywood. Established formulas crumbled, proven genres imploded, and some of the biggest names in the business watched their passion projects vanish into box office oblivion. Let's dive into the wreckage. Lost Horizon arrived as a gamble built on past glory. Flush from a recent blockbuster, producer Ross Hunter paid heavily to remake a revered classic as a full-scale musical spectacle. The ingredients looked impressive on paper: a hit-making songwriting duo, a prestigious ensemble cast, and an elaborate Shangri-La constructed on a studio backlot at enormous expense. But the illusion collapsed quickly. None of the lead actors could sing, forcing awkward dubbing that never matched the performances. But the choreography felt stiff and outdated. Costumes looked improvised rather than inspired. What was meant to feel transcendent came off artificial and tone-deaf. Worst of all, the film arrived in 1973, when audiences were rejecting escapist fantasy in favor of grit, realism, and emotional urgency. The numbers were brutal. With costs climbing past $6 million and marketing pushing higher, the film earned barely $3.8 million. Critics savaged it. Industry ridicule followed. While the soundtrack sold modestly and overseas curiosity briefly surfaced, it changed nothing. Lost Horizon became a tombstone, not just for itself, but for the roadshow musical era it quietly buried. Jonathan Livingston Seagull was director Hall Bartlett's obsession. He'd read Richard Bach's slim novella in a barbershop and immediately bought the rights for $100,000 plus 50% of profits, mortgaging his home and investing every penny of his life savings into the $1.5 million production. The film featured real seagulls, trained birds, and radio-controlled gliders, superimposed with human dialogue. James Franciscus voiced Jonathan, a nonconformist seagull who breaks the 60-mile-per-hour barrier and gets banished from his flock for daring to dream. The photography was stunning. Neil Diamond's soundtrack would go multi-platinum, but the movie was metaphysical drivel dressed as nature documentary. Roger Ebert walked out 45 minutes in, one of only 4 times he'd abandon a film. The critics called it pseudo-cultural and for the birds. The voices sounded disconnected and bizarre, like the mamas and the papas on a bad acid trip emanating from seagull beaks. Worse, the production imploded behind the scenes. Bach sued Bartlett for refusing to honor his final cut rights. Diamond sued over how his music was used. Director Ovadi Jolber sued claiming plagiarism. The finished film barely recouped its production costs at the box office. Only the soundtrack's success kept it from total disaster. Still, it was chosen for a command performance before Queen Elizabeth and developed a cult following among those who embraced its New Age philosophy. For everyone else, it remained a baffling curiosity, proof that not every bestseller translates to cinema, no matter how hard you believe. George C. Scott played a marine biologist who teaches 2 dolphins to speak English. The setup sounds like science fiction. The twist is pure paranoid thriller. Shadowy government operatives kidnap the dolphins to assassinate the President of the United States using a limpet mine. The film should have been Nichols' comeback. Instead, it became his nightmare. Scott paid $750,000, reported sick the first 3 days, and ran production over schedule. Nichols had zero interest in the project and did minimal pre-production, disappeared during filming, and barely touched the editing room. Critics panned it. Pauline Kael suggested that if talking dolphins were the best Nichols could do, he should quit filmmaking altogether. The film was supposed to be a major hit with a substantial budget. Instead, it bombed catastrophically and disappeared from theaters within weeks. Yet there's heartbreak in The Day of the Dolphin. The ending, when Scott must convince his beloved dolphins to swim away to freedom, reduces audiences to tears. The voices Alpha and Beta use, though eerie at first, grow genuinely affecting. And buried beneath the preposterous plot is a legitimate warning about exploiting nature for political ends. Nichols would retreat from Hollywood for nearly a decade after this failure. Sometimes even masters choose the wrong material. But while Nichols stumbled, legendary director Stanley Kramer was falling even harder with Oklahoma Crude. Set in 1913, the film starred Faye Dunaway as a stubborn oil driller defending her land from corporate goons, with George C. and Scott as a drifting hired hand, and Jack Palance as the villain. Kramer had built his reputation on message films. Judgment at Nuremberg, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, On the Beach. Oklahoma Crude tried blending his social conscience with neo-Western comedy. The result was tonal chaos. Was it comedy? Drama? Western? Nobody could tell, including the actors. Dunaway played her role completely humorless. Scott performed as if trapped in broad farce. Palance spoofed his own clenched jaw persona. The production values were solid. It was shot on location with authentic period detail. But the script and direction never gelled. The film failed to find its audience. Critics noted Kramer, like contemporaries Billy Wilder and Otto Preminger, seemed lost in the 1970s, unable to adapt to changing tastes. It's now considered one of Kramer's later flops. A box office disappointment despite the big names attached. Yet some modern viewers find charm in its off-kilter energy and Dunaway's fearless commitment to playing a crude, unsympathetic woman in a man's world. At the time, though, audiences stayed home. Speaking of audiences staying home, here's where the pattern reveals itself. These weren't isolated failures. This was systemic collapse. Hollywood in 1973 was throwing money at prestige projects, big stars, and proven formulas, only to watch them crater. The studio system that had dominated for decades no longer understood its audience. Young filmmakers like Coppola, Scorsese, and Lucas were rewriting the rules, and the old guard couldn't keep up. The most tragic example might be Man of La Mancha, released in late 1972, but struggling through 1973. And this musical adaptation of the Broadway hit cost $12 million. An astronomical sum. United Artists had paid $2.25 million just for the rights, the second highest amount ever paid for a musical after My Fair Lady. Peter O'Toole was cast as Cervantes and Don Quixote despite being unable to sing. His voice was dubbed by Simon Gilbert. Sophia Loren did her own singing, but was equally miscast. James Coco provided comic relief. The production was troubled from the start. Multiple directors were fired, the screenplay was rewritten repeatedly, and O'Toole openly hated the experience. The film opened strong, topping box office for 1 week in December 1972. But word of mouth killed it. Audiences complained about the dubbing, the deliberate pacing, and the fact the first musical number didn't arrive for nearly 20 minutes. It generated just $3.8 million in US and Canada rentals, grossing approximately $11.5 million worldwide, barely breaking even against its budget. Critics were brutal. Roger Ebert called it a collection of dialogue that would sound incredibly dumb if it weren't in a musical, and the musical it's in ain't worth it. Vincent Canby termed it slow and lethal opera buffa. Compared to Cabaret, which came out the same year and swept the Oscars, Man of La Mancha looked hopelessly old-fashioned. Creator Dale Wasserman later wrote that he strongly disliked the film, calling it exaggerated. The movie received Oscar nominations for Best Music and Costume Design, but won nothing. It became another nail in the musical's coffin. Yet audiences who saw it as children remember being moved to tears. Decades later, and some consider it unfairly maligned, but in 1973, it was simply the wrong movie at the wrong time. The pattern continued with films that tried updating classic literature. Tom Sawyer, the Reader's Digest-produced musical adaptation of Mark Twain's novel, featured Johnny Whitaker as Tom, Jodie Foster as Becky Thatcher, and a score by the Sherman Brothers. The film was competent, but uninspired. Shot on location around Hannibal, Missouri, it captured the period details faithfully. The cast was charming. Warren Oates delivered a memorable performance as Muff Potter, but the musical numbers felt tacked on and forgettable. The Sherman Brothers' score was serviceable at best, nowhere near their Mary Poppins heights. Critics praised its unpretentiousness, but noted it lacked the magic of true children's classics. The audiences mostly stayed away. It received 3 Oscar nominations: Best Original Song Score, Best Art Direction, and Best Costume Design, but won nothing, losing everything to the sting. The film has never been considered a commercial success. Cliff Notes bluntly states, "As popular as the novel is, there has never been a commercially successful film made from it." Tom Sawyer 1973 was another victim of the dying musical genre. Pleasant enough, but nobody needed it. Meanwhile, European art cinema was facing its own costly reckoning. One of the era's most ambitious productions became a cautionary tale almost immediately. A 4-hour historical epic, shot on location in real royal castles and mounted at enormous expense, pushed its director to physical collapse. Midway through production, he suffered a stroke, but yet the film continued forward, driven by prestige and scale rather than restraint. The story centered on a reclusive monarch whose obsessions drained an entire kingdom. Lavish sets, operatic themes, and philosophical introspection dominated the narrative. But panic set in before release. Producers grew nervous about the runtime and the film's frank treatment of sexuality. Without the director's consent, the film was cut down repeatedly. Entire thematic cores were removed. What remained was fragmented and incoherent. The shortened version premiered to controversy and confusion. Audiences rejected it. Box office returns were disastrous across multiple countries. When an even more truncated version reached American theaters, critics were merciless, dismissing it as bloated and lifeless. Years later, Eve, the original cut, was restored and reassessed as a masterpiece. But at the time, it was just another expensive failure. The lesson was clear. Prestige without trust and ambition without courage had become liabilities rather than guarantees. This prestige adaptation arrived weighted down by reputation. A celebrated playwright, a respected director, a cast anchored by serious dramatic talent. On paper, it looked like awards bait designed for adult audiences who still believed literary gravitas guaranteed relevance. The production leaned fully into that assumption, committing to an unusually long runtime and absolute fidelity to the source material. What emerged was a punishing experience for general audiences. Nearly 4 hours of dense dialogue, bleak philosophy, and an emotional stagnation tested patience rather than rewarding it. The film refused compromise. There was no attempt to streamline, energize, or reframe the material for cinema. Performances were committed but exhausting, locked into a tone of despair that never lifted. Viewers didn't disengage slowly. They simply didn't show up. Commercially, the result was disastrous. Prestige could not offset endurance. The film failed to attract mainstream audiences and offered no alternative hook for casual viewers. In hindsight, it stands as a monument to a fading belief that seriousness alone could carry a film. By the mid-1970s, that era was already ending. This adaptation arrived with impeccable credentials: a Pulitzer Prize-winning play, legendary performers, a reputation for psychological depth and intellectual rigor. It was marketed as refined, adult drama meant for discerning audiences still willing to sit with discomfort. But discomfort was exactly the problem. The story unfolded almost entirely through conversation, circling anxiety, repression, and emotional paralysis without release. For moviegoers seeking movement, tension, or escape, it felt claustrophobic and inert. The characters' conflicts were internal, abstract, and relentlessly grim. The film demanded patience without offering momentum. Audiences stayed away. The box office response was swift and unforgiving, confirming that chamber dramas rooted in upper-class disintegration no longer resonated. The failure wasn't about quality. It was about timing. By this point, mainstream viewers had little appetite for talk-heavy psychological dissections disguised as prestige cinema. Today, the film is rarely revisited outside academic or theatrical circles. It survives as evidence that cultural relevance matters as much as pedigree, and that even icons can't sell a film the audience has already left behind. This Cold War thriller was built on familiarity, a proven star, an experienced director, a genre that had delivered reliable returns for over a decade. Warner Brothers expected a solid hit, smart, controlled, and commercially viable. Instead, the film arrived into exhaustion. The spy genre was already overcrowded, and this entry offered little urgency or distinction. The pacing was measured to the point of inertia. The intrigue felt procedural rather than suspenseful. As performances were restrained, even detached, leaving little emotional grip, audiences responded with indifference. Box office returns were middling. Not disastrous, but deeply disappointing for a film expected to anchor a release slate. Without controversy or passion, positive or negative, the movie simply vanished. In retrospect, its failure wasn't dramatic. It was quiet. The worst kind for a studio hoping to launch momentum. The film stands as a casualty of oversaturation, released into a market that had grown tired of the very thing it was selling. This character-driven drama arrived carrying the highest possible artistic endorsement, international acclaim, critical praise. A major festival win. It should have crossed over. It didn't. The film was deliberately small, slow, and emotionally raw. When built around two drifters drifting through loneliness and failure, it rejected plot in favor of mood and human fragility. There were no easy arcs, no triumphs, just quiet despair unfolding one scene at a time. American audiences weren't ready. Despite the star power involved, the film's downbeat tone offered no comfort and no spectacle. Commercially, it collapsed. The disconnect between critical celebration and audience rejection was stark. Over time, it earned respect as a serious piece of 1970s cinema, but that reassessment came far too late to matter financially. At release, it confirmed a growing truth. Awards and artistry no longer guaranteed survival at the box office. This intimate sports drama arrived with everything critics admired: a restrained performance, a human-scale story, emotional sincerity without manipulation. It avoided spectacle and embraced melancholy. Audiences responded with silence. The film's pacing was gentle, its tone subdued, its emotional beats quiet rather than rousing. For viewers conditioned to expect uplift or excitement from sports stories, this approach felt almost anti-commercial. It asked patience and empathy, not applause. At the box office, it underperformed. Praise did not translate into ticket sales. The film found admiration later, especially for its central performance. But its initial failure reinforced a painful industry lesson. In the mid-1970s, subtlety had a cost, and films that whispered, no matter how beautifully, were being drowned out by a changing marketplace that no longer waited to listen. This romantic drama was built on material that had already proven itself. Adapted from a successful Broadway play and led by an internationally respected actress, the film positioned itself as sophisticated, intimate, and emotionally mature. The story centered on a May-December romance set against a European backdrop, aiming to attract adult audiences looking for something refined rather than flashy. What undermined the film was timing. By the mid-1970s, audience tastes were shifting rapidly, and romantic dramas without spectacle were losing traction. While the performances were restrained and tasteful, the premise felt out of step with a movie-going public increasingly drawn to high-concept thrills. Marketing struggled to define the film's appeal, and younger audiences showed little interest in its measured tone. And when it reached theaters, reviews were respectful, but ticket sales never followed. Financially, the film underperformed, quietly exiting cinemas without momentum. There was no scandal, no production chaos, just indifference. In the years since, it has remained largely overlooked, remembered mostly by theater enthusiasts familiar with the original play. Today, it stands as a reminder that critical approval means little when cultural winds shift against an entire genre. This character-driven drama arrived with strong performances and serious artistic intent. Built around a grounded, emotionally complex relationship, it aimed to tell a human story rather than deliver escapism. Critics responded warmly, praising the acting and authenticity, and awards attention followed. Audiences, however, stayed away. The film's tone was somber and intimate, dealing openly with loneliness, regret, and imperfect lives. An R rating narrowed its reach, keeping families away, while its sentimental core failed to fully connect with younger, countercultural viewers. It occupied an uncomfortable middle ground, too raw for mainstream crowds, too conventional for art house audiences seeking experimentation. At the box office, the numbers disappointed. Despite critical praise and industry respect, the film failed to translate acclaim into ticket sales. For the studio, it reinforced the growing gap between awards recognition and commercial viability. Over time, the film gained appreciation for its performances and emotional honesty, but it remains an example of how prestige dramas could still falter when audiences simply weren't in the mood to engage. This urban crime drama arrived carrying television pedigree and a respected leading man fresh off major acclaim. Adapted from a popular novel and positioned as a gritty, street-level portrait of police life, it aimed to capture the realism audiences claimed to crave. The studio expected adult viewers to respond to its procedural authenticity and character-driven focus. Instead, it slipped through theaters with barely a ripple. The tone was subdued, more reflective than explosive, and marketing struggled to distinguish it from the growing wave of harder-edged cop films released into a marketplace already embracing more confrontational crime stories. It felt cautious rather than urgent. Reviews were mixed, respectful but restrained, and without strong word of mouth, attendance faded quickly. Financially, it underperformed against expectations, failing to justify its positioning as a prestige urban drama. What was meant to feel grounded and timely instead appeared muted and forgettable. In a year defined by shifting tastes, subtle realism proved no safer than spectacle. Each failure told the same story. In 1973, Hollywood no longer understood its audience. Studios kept pouring money into familiar formulas and watched them collapse. Musicals faded. Prestige epics stalled. Star-driven projects lost momentum. That year proved a brutal truth. You could have the biggest budgets, the best talent, and the purest intentions, and still fail spectacularly if you were making movies for an audience that no longer existed. The myth was collapsing, and from the wreckage, something leaner, darker, and more honest was already forming. The future was coming fast, and it looked nothing like Shangri-La.